Hello and welcome to Future Review. Today I'll be sharing with you part 1 of The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. As usual with book reviews, spoiler alert, if this is a problem, please leave the video now. You have been warned. And with that, let me start with the book. The Time Machine begins at a Victorian English dinner party, where the main character, referred to throughout the book as the Time Traveler, is explaining a concept that he's been working on for 2 years to his guests. He explains to them that time is a dimension, like the three physical dimensions of length, width, and height, and that it can be traveled along, like those three, which allows for time travel. The guests are incredulous, but everyone is in agreement that time travel would be very interesting if it existed, since it would allow you to see history with no filter, or experience the wonders of the future far beyond your own time. The time traveler then pulls out a device that he's been working on for these past 2 years, and he explains that this is a prototype of a time machine that he's been building. The guests don't believe this, and the subject is dropped for the time being. A week later, at the next dinner party hosted by the time traveler, he is uncharacteristically late, which worries the guests a little bit. In the middle of the dinner, he shows up in a ragged and disheveled state, leading the guests to ask him what has happened to you. The time traveler gets something to eat, and then sits down all his guests to hear the tale of what has just happened to him. The time traveler explains that earlier that day he decided to test his time machine for the first time, and so he holds his device and cranks the levers on it a little bit. At first, everything in the laboratory seems the same, but then looks at the clock and realizes that it's 5 hours after he started the test. The time machine worked, and he traveled 5 hours into the future. The time traveler is ecstatic at his success and decides that he wants to test his device again, this time going much further into the future. And so he sets up the device again, cranks the levers much harder this time, and rockets into the future. He accelerates into the future much more than before. He sees people living their lives on the street. He sees buildings rise and fall, and eventually the city itself disappears. The time traveler eventually realizes that he should probably stay within the bounds of what he knows as society, because if he goes too far into the future, there may be dangers that he doesn't know, and so he stops. Eventually. The time machine tells him that he is now in the year 800,000 to 701, pretty far into the future. The city of London seems to have disappeared, and the area seems mostly natural at this point, and it all seems very safe to begin with. But the time traveler is not alone, and he is quickly approached by a group of elegant, small, meaning around 4 feet tall people. It turns out that these people are called Eloi, and generally there's a language barrier between the two of them, as it turns out, as you might expect for people hundreds of thousands of years apart. And the group of Eloi seem to be very interested in the device that he's holding, since it's very exotic to them. And the time traveler gives into pressure to give them the device, although he removes the levers from it so that they can't use it to travel through time. And as he interacts with the Eloi, he finds out some things about them. He finds out that the Eloi live in sleek, elegant buildings, with no urban sprawl or pollution like the Victorian cities he's used to. The Eloi all seem to wear silk-like robes, and they all seem to eat nothing but fruit. But perhaps the most important characteristic about the Eloi that he discovers very early on is their indolence. He tries to get the Eloi to teach him their language, and at first they do so, and he makes some progress, but very quickly they lose interest and just wander off. The more he interacts with the Eloi, the more this indolence is displayed, and the more childlike and immature they seem to be. The Eloi seem to be very whimsical, and their interests shift with the wind. The only common factor is that they seem to want to amuse themselves all day, like children. And this disappoints the time traveler, because he was under the impression that human civilization that far into the future should be infinitely more advanced and better in every way than his own, but that doesn't seem to be the case here. And the time traveler has a theory as to what exactly has happened, that this is in fact a fully communist society, seeing as there is no evidence of hierarchy or economic struggle of any kind in Eloi society. And furthermore, the The time traveler has a theory as to exactly how the Eloi got to this state once they had conquered nature. You see, the time traveler theorizes that strength and intelligence in humans are cultivated by necessity. Because humans had lived in harsh conditions for so long, they had been forced to become stronger and more intelligent, to shape their environment to their liking and to conquer others for their benefit. This had caused a steady upward trend in human strength and intelligence, thus causing improvements and conquest. But it seems that eventually humans had gotten so advanced that they had actually completely conquered nature, and that seems to be where the Eloi had gotten to at some point. Eloi society, as he sees it, has no real struggle of any kind. It has no violence. There are no dangerous animals, diseases, or even bad weather. There doesn't seem to be any economic competition. In short, the Earth seems to be a paradise without any kind of threats or scarcity. And in this environment, the selection pressures of the past have reversed themselves. Strength and intelligence and the energy to use them are a detriment now because you have all this strength and intelligence, but no outlet for them. Whereas the weak and passive are adapted perfectly to this environment. And so over time, with this selection pressure in place, people have regressed into the small, weak, and indolent Eloi. And and so the time traveler is somewhat disappointed by this, but whatever. He'll see what he can get from the society and then go home. And later that night, the time traveler panics as he realizes that he doesn't actually know where the Eloi have put his time machine, but he calms himself down, saying that I'll bide my time and figure out where it is eventually, and then I can go home. And the next day, the time traveler, sees something very interesting, something that disturbs him quite a bit, actually. He sees a group of Eloi bathing in a nearby river, probably the Thames River, because this is where London used to be in the past. The time machine doesn't change its location, it only takes him to time. He sees some Eloi bathing in what is probably the Thames River, and he sees one of them drowning, with a group of nearby Eloi doing absolutely nothing to help her. This is the dark side of the Eloi's indolence, that they will not even put in the effort to save one of their own from drowning if it interferes with their amusement in the moment. And so the time traveler rushes in and dives into the river, drags her to shore, and saves her life. She is duly grateful for this, so the Eloi are not incapable of showing gratitude. It just takes extreme circumstances for it to manifest. And the Eloi that he saves is called Weena, and she does accompany him out of affection for after this incident. And from her, the time traveler learns something else very interesting about Eloi society, which is that they're terrified of the dark. They never go out at night, and that very night, the time traveler, would learn exactly why the Eloi are so terrified of the night. That night, the time traveler when he's up, he witnesses these pale, ugly, ape-like creatures shambling around on the surface and seemingly carrying off bodies, and then going into a shaft that seems to lead underground. The time traveler is understandably disturbed by this, and he, during the daytime, looks down the shaft to see what he can find about them. These creatures that he learns are called Morlocks, and from what he's seen, he deduces that the Eloi are not the only human inhabitants of this world anymore. And he abandons his old theory that this is the result of a fully communist society and comes up with a new theory that the Eloi and the Morlocks are the result of the human species diverging into two subspecies. And the time traveler theorizes that the Eloi and the Morlocks are the descendants of the haves and the have-nots, respectively, of his own society. The time traveler theorizes that in his own time, a lot of working class people already spend a substantial amount of time underground. And so, as industrialization progressed, they would continue to toil underground in deeper and bigger mines, factories, to the point that eventually they would live pretty much their entire lives underground. And at the same time, the wealthier classes of society, the haves, would live in increasingly segregated communities where they would be free with their wealth to pursue education and culture their whole lives. And as they progressed, they would leave nothing. They would, for generations, live lives of nothing but refinement and comfort. And so the time traveler theorizes that over time, these two groups of people, who previously one united species, would eventually adapt to their conditions and diverge into two separate species. The uh, the former working class becoming the subterranean, light-sensitive Morlocks, and the leisure classes becoming the refined but indolent Alloy. And and from the pieces he can put together, the time traveler realizes that the Morlocks, not the Alloy, are the ones that probably have his time machine at this point, and so he's going to need to go into their domain to recover his time machine. But before he can do that, the time traveler decides, to Weena's consternation, to go on a little scouting expedition down the shaft to see what he can find, like about where the Morlocks live. And so he goes down there, and knowing that the Morlocks are extremely sensitive to light, he lights a match to scare away the Morlocks and to provide light for him to see because he doesn't have night vision, unlike the Morlocks. And this works. The Morlocks are mostly kept at bay. And during his time underground, the time traveler sees vast industrial machines seemingly being operated by the Morlocks and meat meals, which seemingly furthers his theory about the Morlocks being the descendants of the industrial working class of his own time. And he gets out, much to Weena's relief. And is at this time that he realizes exactly why the Eloi are so terrified of the so-called dark nights, the nights with no moon, because this is when the Morlocks come out in force and drag off any Eloi they can find to kill and eat. As it turns out, the Morlocks probably keep the Eloi around as livestock because they can no longer fight back, and they serve as one of the few sources of meat left in the world, which the Morlocks take advantage of. Um, and so, after gathering this information, the next day, the time traveler and Weena go off on an expedition in the surrounding forest to a distant structure where there may be things useful to the time traveler. And it turns out this distant structure, when they reach it, is in fact a derelict museum, which is good because in the museum, the time traveler finds some things that are very interesting to him. Notably, he finds a few more matches, which are useful against the Morlocks, and he finds a crude mace that he can use as a weapon in case the Morlocks come around, and that he'll need when he has to invade their home to get his time machine back. Unfortunately, the time traveler and Weena are unable to get back to the Alloy settlement before nightfall, and so they're forced to rest in the open forest. And as you might expect, they get ambushed by Morlocks in the middle of the night. And Weena faints during all this, leaving the time traveler to fight them off all alone. Not that she'd be much of a help anyway. The time traveler, being a not degraded human, is of course much bigger and stronger than the Morlocks, and so he's able to fight them off with the help of his mace and with the matches that scare the Morlocks off. Unfortunately, during this altercation, one of the matches that he was using to scare off the Morlocks, he dropped it at some point, and it caused a forest fire, and so he was forced to escape. The time traveler manages to escape, but Weena and the Morlocks are lost in the blaze. The time traveler is devastated by her loss and resolves that his time here is over. He needs to go back home, and so now is the time to invade the Morlock's stronghold to get his time machine back. And so he sets off, goes underground again, this time looking for his time machine. The Morlocks this time realize what he's looking for, and allow him to reach the time machine, presumably so they can ambush him there and get a nice big meal out of him. But the Morlocks don't know what the device can actually do, so once the time traveler reaches the time machine, he reattaches the levers, and then rockets off into the future, escaping the Morlocks. The time traveler travels millions upon millions of years into the future, and he sees some strange things. He sees giant crabs and butterflies battling it out on blood-red beaches. He sees the last forms of life on Earth, this lichen type of thing. He sees the sun grow larger, redder, and eventually dimmer until it goes out entirely, and the last life on Earth dies, leaving the time traveler standing on a dead world. This time, he's had enough. It's time to go back to his own time. And so he reverses the course of the time machine and goes back to his own time, just in the middle of his dinner party. He stumbles back to the party where he was supposed to be to begin with, and the rest you just heard. You explains to the guests exactly what has happened. The guests again don't believe this incredible story, but the time traveler produces two strange flowers, unlike anything on Earth at their time, as proof of where he's been in the future. And the next day, the time traveler is found preparing for another journey into the future. He tells everyone that he'll be back soon, but it is revealed that this has all been written 3 years after that, and that the time traveler has not been seen since. And that concludes The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. If you enjoyed that, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And until the next video, goodbye for now.